Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She had two heartbeats inside her, one dream, and a system that watched her die. There was no 911 call, no alarms, just silence. And then, a body, two fetuses, and a question no one wants to answer. What killed Valentina Milluzzo wasn't just infection, it was hesitation. And maybe something worse. Valentina was 32. First-time mother, she'd fought for years to get pregnant. The twins, conceived through IVF, were already loved, already named. She was just 19 weeks in when things went wrong. Not catastrophically at first, just wrong enough. On September 29, 2016, she was admitted to Cannizaro Hospital in Catania, Sicily, with early labor symptoms, lower back pain, mild cramping, spotting. A routine assessment showed her cervix was beginning to shorten, a signal to any trained obstetrician that preterm labor was possible. But the fetuses were still alive, and so the file notes read, "Conservative management." From the outside, the hospital appeared competent, clean, reputable. But in Sicily, there was a variable not found in textbooks. Nearly 90% of OB/GYN physicians in the region, including those at Cannizaro, were registered conscientious objectors. That meant that even if the law allowed for medical abortion to save a mother's life, the attending physician could legally refuse to perform it, based on personal or religious beliefs. What no one said out loud, but everyone understood, was that when a pregnancy got complicated and a mother's life was at stake, some doctors stalled, not because they didn't see what was happening, but because they hoped the problem would resolve itself, or, more darkly, that the fetus would die on its own, eliminating the ethical dilemma altogether. In the medical notes, Valentina's blood pressure remained stable for the first 4 days. Mild fever developed on day 5. On day 6, one fetus showed signs of distress. There was meconium in the amniotic fluid. At week 19, that should have triggered high alert observation, and likely in other countries, a termination discussion. Here it didn't. No internal consults, no escalation. The notes simply read, "Awaiting progression." Then on October 14th, the first twin died in utero. That should have been the turning point. Medically, ethically, procedurally, but it wasn't. The physician overseeing her case reportedly told staff, and later, according to the family's attorney, told Valentina herself, "As long as the second fetus has a heartbeat, I will not intervene." This wasn't a quote pulled from a leaked call or misremembered email. This was documented in legal filings, reported in national newspapers, and repeated under oath. And in that moment, everything about the system surrounding Valentina turned inward. Medical logic was no longer the driver. Conscience was. What happened next unfolded fast. Too fast. October 15th, Valentina spiked a fever of 39.6 Celsius. Her blood pressure dropped. Oxygen levels fell below 88%. Lab results pulled later in the investigation showed a rising white cell count and lactate levels consistent with early-stage septicemia. She was vomiting, disoriented, but still, no antibiotics, no decision to terminate the pregnancy, no transfer to intensive care. At 3:41 a.m., she managed to send a final message to her mother. "Mama, I feel cold." She died hours later, officially pronounced dead, at 4:45 a.m. on October 16th. Two fetuses, both non-viable, one mother, now gone, and 0 documented emergency interventions. That morning, her parents weren't told the specifics, and they were told she'd passed due to complications, that the pregnancy had failed, that it was tragic but natural. But what exactly was natural about ignoring protocol? When the family demanded her records, they saw the gaps. No escalation orders, no surgical prep, no antibiotics until the final hour, when it was too late. And something else, an unusual number of manual edits to the digital chart, most of them time-stamped after her death. Weeks later, a formal investigation began. 7 doctors were placed under review. 4 were eventually charged. But at the core of the case wasn't just negligence. It was the uneasy question Italy continues to face. Can a doctor's personal beliefs override a patient's right to life-saving care? And if so, What stops that line from becoming fatal? Why was no intervention initiated after fetal death on October 14th? Valentina Milluzzo's death didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in Sicily, a region with one of the highest rates of conscientious objection among medical professionals in Western Europe. And that context matters. It reframes everything that followed. Every delayed order, every unlogged symptom, every non-action disguised as protocol. After her death, public outrage flared, not just because she died, but because no one at Cannizzaro Hospital seemed surprised she did. There were no emergency debriefs, no internal memos acknowledging error, just a statement from the hospital's spokesperson. It was a natural miscarriage. Nothing unethical occurred. That narrative collapsed quickly. Within 2 weeks of her death, the family's legal team secured full access to her digital medical records, including revision logs. What they uncovered wasn't graphic or gory. It was sterile, sanitized, and that was the problem. Forensic auditors noted the following: no progress notes from the lead physician between October 14th and the time of death. Vital signs showing progressive instability, temperature over 39.5 degrees Celsius, hypotension, tachycardia, were documented but not escalated. Most importantly, the EMR, electronic medical record, showed multiple backdated entries added between 6:15 a.m. and 7:45 a.m., hours after Valentina was pronounced dead. The edits weren't major. They didn't alter test results, but they reframed the narrative. For example, original note timestamped October 15th, 9:04 p.m. Patient febrile. Monitoring continues. Revised entry added October 16th, 6:23 a.m. Febrile response controlled with paracetamol. Fetal cardiac activity stable. No paracetamol was administered. There was no fetal cardiac activity. Both fetuses had already died. The revision created the illusion of stability. It shifted the optics of negligence into the realm of inevitability. During preliminary review, a judicial expert appointed by the Catania prosecutor's office described the chart as incomplete and editorialized. And yet, no one inside the hospital came forward. Not a single nurse, midwife, or junior doctor offered a conflicting account in the early days of the inquiry. That silence, investigators noted, was louder than any statement. Behind closed doors, local health officials expressed concern about the hospital's risk management protocols. But publicly, the regional health authority defended the staff, citing protocol-driven caution under complex ethical circumstances. Here's where that defense begins to unravel. Under Italian law, specifically Law 194, a physician may refuse to perform abortions based on personal moral or religious beliefs. However, that objection must be formally declared and documented. And even then, the law requires the hospital to ensure care is provided by a non-objecting colleague when the mother's health is at risk. At Cannizzaro, according to internal records, the majority of OB/GYN physicians were registered objectors. On any given night shift, there may have been no available provider willing to terminate a pregnancy, even in a case involving sepsis or fetal demise. When asked during the first round of depositions whether a non-objecting doctor had been summoned, the lead physician reportedly stated there was no immediate necessity to intervene. The patient was being monitored. This isn't just a matter of opinion. In forensic medicine, the timing of intervention in obstetric sepsis is critical. Studies showed that mortality risk increases exponentially with every hour of delay. The data from Valentina's case showed over 10 hours between documented signs of systemic infection and any form of critical escalation, which never came. One investigator, reviewing the case chronology, wrote, "The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. It was like no one was ever in the room with her." But Valentina wasn't alone. Her husband was outside the room. Her parents had been calling the nurse's desk repeatedly, asking if they could speak to her. They were told she was asleep. The real question is, how many people looked away because the fetus still had a heartbeat? That single fact, a fluttering line on a monitor, became a shield, a legal gray zone, a reason not to act. Even more disturbing was what the investigation didn't find. No code blue alert was ever triggered. No internal transfer request to ICU. No OB/GYN on-call escalation. No surgical consult requested. As one legal observer noted, this isn't a matter of proving malicious intent. It's a matter of showing that inaction, when protocol demands action, becomes the fatal act. At this stage in the investigation, only one fact stood out with clarity. A preventable death had occurred. The cause wasn't mystery, it was policy, or more precisely, the selective interpretation of policy under the cover of personal belief. And the most pressing question for prosecutors became this: was Valentina Milluzzo denied care because of religious conviction, or because the system had no contingency plan for when religion and medicine clashed? By the time Valentina Milluzzo entered the final 24 hours of her life, her body was no longer fighting pregnancy complications. It was fighting systemic infection and losing. From a clinical perspective, the signs weren't vague. They were measurable, traceable, and time-stamped. This chapter is about what those numbers meant and what never followed. Sepsis is not an ambiguous condition. It doesn't sneak up silently. It announces itself through elevated heart rate, fever, hypotension, altered breathing, and changes in mental status. In obstetric medicine, where two lives are often at stake, the window to act is narrow. And when a fetal demise occurs, that window narrows further. By October 14th, Valentina had passed that threshold. The forensic report obtained during the 2017 legal inquiry included full lab records from Cannizzaro Hospital. They showed a white blood cell count of 20,300 per UL. Lactate levels had climbed above 3.9 mmol/UL. Her core temperature remained above 39.5 degrees Celsius for more than 8 consecutive hours. Her systolic blood pressure dipped below 90 in the monthly mmHg at least twice. No interventions were ordered during that time. The sepsis protocol at Cannizzaro, modeled after Italy's national maternal emergency standards, dictated immediate fluid resuscitation, empirical antibiotic therapy, and obstetric evaluation to assess whether surgical delivery or uterine evacuation was indicated. But those steps never occurred. Not once. Instead, notes from nursing staff used vague language: continuing to monitor, patient resting, no new complaints. A medical expert reviewing the case later testified, from 10 o'clock p.m. on the 14th to 3 o'clock a.m. on the 16th, there were at least 5 distinct clinical thresholds crossed that should have triggered an escalation. None were acted upon. No blood cultures were drawn. No infectious disease consult was requested. No indication of concern documented from the lead physician. In fact, the only actionable step documented during those critical hours was the continuation of a fetal heartbeat check, even after the first fetus had died. From a timeline standpoint, the second fetus was confirmed deceased at approximately 2:40 a.m. on October 16th. Valentina was pronounced dead 125 minutes later. By then, multiple organ systems had begun to fail. Her oxygen saturation had dropped below 80%. Pupillary response was slow. A crash cart was finally wheeled in, but only after respiratory arrest had already set in. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as septic shock complicated by intrauterine infection. There were no signs of pre-existing conditions, no chronic illness, no clotting disorders. The forensic pathologist noted necrotic tissue in the endometrial lining, consistent with retained fetal remains and bacterial proliferation. Death, according to the official ruling, was medically avoidable under standard obstetric emergency intervention. This wasn't a theoretical lapse. It was a textbook failure. Every action that could have reversed the trajectory was outlined in national protocols. Yet in Valentina's case, the absence of timely treatment suggested something more than clinical hesitation. It suggested institutional paralysis. The legal filings would later state, intervention was neither attempted nor planned. The attending personnel deferred to an interpretation of fetal viability that directly contradicted emergency maternal care standards. That interpretation, prioritizing the heartbeat of a fetus over the declining vitals of a mother, remains at the heart of this investigation. Some members of the medical board later argued that the delay in intervention was not negligence, but caution. That they were balancing complex ethical and clinical considerations. But forensic medicine doesn't balance ethics. It tracks signs. It identifies turning points. And Valentina's labs, her vitals, her deterioration, all pointed in one direction long before she was gone. An investigator involved in the review noted, "If there was ever a case to measure in hours lost, not actions taken, this was it." At the conclusion of the internal hospital inquiry, no staff members were sanctioned, no protocols were updated, and no acknowledgement of error was ever made public by Cannizzaro leadership. The records showed infection, the labs confirmed it, the protocols existed. Still, no one acted. If everything pointed to intervention, what were they waiting for? By October 16, 2016, Valentina Milluzzo had been in Cannizzaro Hospital in Catania for over 2 weeks. She was 19 weeks into a twin pregnancy and had already shown signs of premature complications. Earlier chapters detailed the moment her water broke and her condition began to deteriorate. But what happened in those final 24 hours reveals more than just medical negligence. It raises questions about a deeper institutional failure cloaked under the veil of conscience-based medical objection. Let's step back into the room. At 1:30 a.m., Valentina's body temperature climbed sharply. According to the nurse's station log, a fever was recorded at 39.8 degrees, 103.6 degrees, accompanied by chills and increasing abdominal pain. Yet no proactive administration of broad-spectrum antibiotics was documented at this time. The hospital's defense would later claim that sepsis had already been developing, too far along to halt, but the absence of any aggressive early-stage response is a central focus in the family's legal filing. Around 3 a.m., Valentina reportedly said to her mother, "I feel like something is wrong." She clutched her abdomen, sweating, and whispered that she was struggling to breathe. Medical records show her oxygen saturation dipped below 90%, but no oxygen support was initiated until later in the morning. At 4:15 a.m., the heart rate of one fetus began to decelerate. A resident noted the event and allegedly consulted the lead attending physician. The doctor on duty, later identified as one who had previously declared a moral objection to abortion, was briefed on Valentina's worsening state. What follows remains one of the most controversial elements in the case. According to the family's legal team, this physician allegedly stated, "As long as the fetus is alive, I will not intervene." This wasn't an isolated whisper. That quote was relayed by Valentina's mother under sworn affidavit and repeated by the family lawyer in the formal criminal complaint. It became a flashpoint in the investigation. Medical guidelines in Italy, under Law 194, permit termination of pregnancy to save the mother's life, even when fetal viability has not yet been achieved. But in Sicily, where up to 87% of OB/GYNs reportedly identify as conscientious objectors, the line between legal duty and personal ethics often blurs. The question this raises is simple but haunting. Was Valentina's death a result of an individual decision, or did a system quietly endorse inaction? Later that morning, the first fetus died. Valentina's temperature had soared to 40.3 degrees, 104.5 degrees, and she was delirious. Still, the decision to surgically intervene came too late. By the time the second fetus was delivered, Valentina had already entered septic shock. She coded at approximately 1 p.m. and was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. Post-mortem results confirmed the cause, septicemia resulting from an intrauterine infection. To this day, the precise timing of the infection's onset remains debated. What is not in question is this: no life-saving intervention was initiated when it was still possible, and no override system existed to challenge a doctor's refusal to act based on personal conscience, even in a life-threatening scenario. This is where the investigation began to widen. Prosecutors in Catania launched a formal inquiry not only into individual medical decisions but into the hospital's structural protocols. Were patients informed of their doctor's moral stances? Did the institution have a backup plan for emergency terminations? Internal communication logs and shift assignments became evidence. Statements from nurses were gathered. Legal experts began dissecting Law 194 with fresh urgency. For many, this was no longer about one woman. It was about a medical system that could allow ideology to silently override survival. And here's what's most difficult to digest. Valentina never had a say. She wasn't asked whether she wished to prioritize her own life. She wasn't consulted with urgency when the first signs of infection appeared. Her autonomy was quietly bypassed in a room full of professionals trained to preserve it. The family's grief turned to action. They began speaking to the press. "We don't want revenge," her mother said. "We want the truth to be known." The silence in room 5B, where Valentina spent her final hours, echoes beyond the white walls of Cannizzaro Hospital. It's a silence that forces uncomfortable questions about how conscience clauses function when no one is watching. And who in that moment speaks for the patient whose voice has been lost? By the time Valentina Milluzzo was pronounced dead on October 16, 2016 at Cannizzaro Hospital in Catania, her body had been through an avoidable collapse. What followed was not only a medical autopsy, but a dissection of institutional responsibility, judicial accountability, and medical ethics that stretched far beyond a single patient or even a single ward. The autopsy was carried out within 24 hours of her death. Conducted by forensic pathologists appointed by the Catania Public Prosecutor's Office, the primary objective was to determine cause and timing of death and to identify any clinical mismanagement that could legally constitute manslaughter through omission. The findings were consistent with a rapid and fatal septic progression. Peritoneal cultures and uterine swabs revealed a severe bacterial infection, most likely E. coli, though full-spectrum panels were still pending at the time of the interim report. According to toxicological data, no emergency antibiotics or corticosteroids had been administered until after the death of the first fetus. By then, septicemia was advanced and systemic organ failure had already begun. No evidence of natural cardiac irregularity or structural organ defect was found. There was no indication of rare infection or immune system collapse. The conclusion was clear. Valentina had died from an overwhelming septic shock secondary to intrauterine infection, a condition manageable in earlier stages, if acted on in time. But the report didn't stop at pathology. In collaboration with the Health Ministry's Risk Management Task Force, investigators began cross-referencing the autopsy results with hospital charts, shift logs, and internal communications. One inconsistency stood out. On October 15th, the day before Valentina's death, a nurse entered a note at 7:55 p.m. stating that the patient appeared disoriented, febrile, and complained of worsening abdominal pressure. The note included a request, urgent review by attending OB. But there was no signature or follow-up from any attending physician that night. A full 6 hours passed before another clinical note was entered. That gap, those 6 hours, would become a central argument in the investigation. Family attorneys argued this constituted gross negligence, while hospital representatives claimed a clerical error in logging. The court later ordered retrieval of the hospital's electronic access records, badge scans, login timestamps, and internal messaging. A more disturbing truth began to emerge. No OB/GYN had physically entered Valentina's room between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. And that led back to a hard question. Was the delay in response purely administrative, or was it ideological? One of the attending physicians, under anonymity during the early stages of inquiry, admitted off-record that many staffers were unclear on how far the hospital's conscience clause actually extended in practice. "No one tells you what to do when 2 lives are on the table and you're not allowed to save one," the doctor reportedly said. Italy's Law 194 allows medical professionals to refuse participation in abortion procedures on moral or religious grounds, but it also mandates that hospitals ensure the presence of non-objecting staff to perform life-saving terminations when required. What surfaced from the review was a critical failure of compliance. Cannizzaro Hospital had no overnight OB/GYN on call who was certified and willing to perform emergency fetal evacuation in high-risk maternal sepsis. That is not just a scheduling problem, it is a structural breach of public health duty. In a chilling statement to media outlets, Valentina's father, Francesco Milluzzo, asked, "What law says my daughter must die so that 2 dying fetuses can remain untouched?" His grief was not only for the daughter he lost, but for a system he believed robbed her of the right to be saved. As pressure mounted, prosecutors widened the scope of investigation to include supervisory personnel, including the hospital director, emergency planning coordinators, and risk compliance officers. This wasn't about one doctor anymore. It was about whether the entire institution had operated in silent agreement to let personal belief take precedence over clinical mandate. One detail stood out in the prosecutor's cross-examination of hospital SOPs, standard operating procedures. Nowhere in the emergency maternal care protocol was there a contingency clause for when the sole attending physician objects on moral grounds. There was no documented mechanism to summon a backup. No hotline, no override. From a legal standpoint, that omission would become a cornerstone in the case file under omesso soccorso, failure to provide aid. The forensic phase of the investigation brought forth no ambiguity about Valentina's cause of death, but it also laid bare the quiet network of inaction that allowed it to happen. No physical force was used, no weapon involved, and yet the result was the same as if someone had pulled a trigger, because no one stepped in to prevent a death that didn't need to happen. On October 15, 2016, Valentina Milluzzo's condition was no longer stable. At 19 weeks pregnant with twins, she had been hospitalized for several days at Cannizzaro Hospital in Catania. Despite signs of infection and fetal distress, no surgical intervention had been ordered. Medical notes later reviewed confirmed that one fetus lost cardiac activity by early afternoon. The second followed hours later. Only then did staff initiate extraction. By that point, Valentina was already in septic shock. Blood cultures later identified E. coli infection, consistent with chorioamnionitis, a uterine infection often fatal when untreated. Despite intensive care efforts, Valentina died in the early hours of October 16th. Her cause of death, sepsis due to delayed intervention. The central question, why did the hospital wait? According to Valentina's mother, a doctor stated directly, "As long as there's a heartbeat, I cannot intervene." Italian law allows doctors to object to abortion on moral grounds, but requires life-saving action if the mother is at risk. The delay raised serious legal and ethical concerns. Internal hospital communications later examined hinted at a passive policy: wait for fetal death before acting. Meanwhile, medical records showed warning signs: fever, high white blood cell counts, signs of infection were already present 24 hours earlier. Hospital officials defended their actions, claiming the miscarriage was spontaneous, but prosecutors launched a full investigation into potential criminal negligence. Public outrage followed. Demonstrators gathered outside Cannizzaro Hospital. The Milluzzo case became a flashpoint in Italy's ongoing debate over abortion access and medical conscience. The autopsy was performed less than 48 hours after Valentina Milluzzo was pronounced dead at Cannizzaro Hospital. The formal request came from the Catania Public Prosecutor's Office, standard procedure in cases involving unexpected hospital fatalities. But in this instance, it carried the weight of national scrutiny. The report confirmed what medical staff already suspected but failed to act upon: the presence of severe septicemia caused by chorioamnionitis. A bacterial infection of the fetal membranes had gone untreated long enough to enter Valentina's bloodstream. Her organs failed in a matter of hours. This was no sudden event. It was a progression. Measurable, trackable, preventable. Laboratory results isolated Escherichia coli, a pathogen frequently linked to ascending infections in complicated pregnancies. Toxicological tests showed no external substances, no signs of malpractice via dosage or medication. But what stood out was what wasn't there: no surgical incision marks, no records of attempted intervention before fetal cardiac arrest. The autopsy timeline aligned with family testimonies. Both fetuses had demised prior to any medical extraction. Valentina's sepsis had already progressed beyond the point of clinical reversal. Authorities secured hospital surveillance footage and physician rosters. All staff on shift during the final 18 hours were summoned for formal questioning. Some responses were cooperative, others vague. One junior nurse stated, "We kept asking for direction, but the lead physician said we had to wait." That lead physician, unnamed publicly due to the investigation, was reportedly known for registering a conscientious objection to abortion, legally permitted under Italian law, but only when it doesn't endanger the life of the mother. Hospital administrators issued a press release the next morning, denying delays, stating that all actions followed standard miscarriage protocol. But that narrative faltered under review. Case notes lacked time-stamped intervention logs. Vital signs were documented, but without concurrent response entries. The final hours in Valentina's chart read more like passive observation than medical management. Behind closed doors, investigators began comparing her case to prior obstetric emergencies at the facility. Patterns emerged: At least 3 prior instances where pregnant patients developed complications in the second trimester and reported delayed care due to provider objections. None had resulted in fatality until now. Public prosecutor Carmelo Zucchero confirmed that preliminary evidence suggested possible omission of urgent care in the presence of an evident maternal infection. It was a diplomatic way of pointing toward criminal negligence. Meanwhile, the case had shifted beyond a local probe. Women's rights organizations staged protests in Palermo and Rome. International media outlets began covering what they called Italy's conscience clause crisis. Even medical unions weighed in, some defending the right to object, others demanding reform to prioritize patient survival. In effect, the autopsy confirmed what the family feared. Valentina didn't die in a tragic accident. She died in a window where action was possible but wasn't taken. And in the sterile language of that autopsy report, a silence louder than any protest echoed back. No indication of intervention, no scalpel, no removal, no chance. Catania, Sicily, October 2016. Valentina Milluzzo's death did not end with a death certificate. It exposed the cost of a legal system that permitted doctors to delay care based on conscience, even when delay meant death. Her autopsy confirmed what her parents feared. She died from sepsis, caused by a miscarriage that wasn't properly managed. The physician had refused to intervene while the fetuses still had heartbeats. He cited Italy's Law 194, allowing medical personnel to object to abortion procedures. But Valentina wasn't seeking abortion. She was dying, and the law became a wall between her and survival. The hospital maintained that it was a natural miscarriage, claiming no wrongdoing. But documents and testimony suggested otherwise, that delays in treatment, reluctance to act, and rigid interpretation of medical ethics created a fatal vacuum. Public anger spread beyond Catania. Candlelight vigils appeared in major cities. Hashtags like #Justitia per Valentina filled social media. Protesters demanded change, not just justice for Valentina, but safeguards to prevent another death under similar circumstances. Under pressure, Italy's Ministry of Health initiated an internal review. Parliamentary members proposed revisions to Law 194, including mandatory availability of non-objecting physicians in emergency shifts. Though no criminal charges were filed, prosecutors launched an in-depth inquiry into the hospital's decision-making protocols. Valentina's parents continued their public efforts, not to punish, but to reform. In their words, no doctor should be able to watch someone die and say it was legal. By 2018, the Constitutional Court clarified that while doctors may hold personal beliefs, those beliefs cannot override emergency care when a life is at risk. Though subtle, this shift was traced back to the Milluzzo case. Valentina became a symbol of systemic inaction. Her death led to policy reviews, sparked new hospital guidelines, and forced a national conversation about the ethical boundary between belief and duty. We may never rewrite what happened to Valentina, but we can decide what happens next, for ourselves, our families, and our communities. If her story teaches us anything, it's this. Silence in the face of injustice costs lives. Ask questions, demand clarity, because policy without accountability isn't just a risk, it's a danger. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe personal beliefs should ever stand between a doctor and their duty to save a life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? If this story moved you, or even if it didn't, tell me why. Let's talk about it. And if you want to see more real-life stories that dig deep and matter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your voice makes this space what it is.